So we're here today with Marcus Mietzner. He's associate professor at the Australian National University, and he kindly agreed to talk about Jokowi's presidency and how Jokowi is dealing with some extraordinary developments in Indonesia. Hi Marcus, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so why don't you start with what was the conventional wisdom until just a couple of months ago about Jokowi's presidency?
Well, it was widely agreed, I think, by everyone who watched this closely that he had a disastrous first year, but that in his second year he had consolidated his power. And he had consolidated power by forcing a number of political parties to abandon their oppositional stance towards his government and turn into loyalist supporters of his administration. So he increased the level of support he enjoyed in Parliament from 37% in 2015 to 69% just a year later. That was accompanied by a significant increase in his popularity as well, which jumped from 40% in 2015 to now around 70%. So both in terms of control over elite institutions as well as commanding great levels of popular support, he seemed to have settled firmly into the presidency after, again, a pretty lackluster first year in office.
But things certainly look a little bit different because of the governor's race in Jakarta, and more importantly, Ahok's speech in September, which has been considered to have been an account of blasphemous. How did a speech out in the islands outside Jakarta resound with such a political earthquake?
Yeah, a number of things here to consider. Number one is the macro-political context. I would argue that in fact it was precisely Jokowi's strength, precisely his control over the existing elite institutions and his large popularity that drove his remaining opponents into the search for alternative measures of political opposition against Jokowi.
And who would have thought, as you point out, they chose something that Indonesia hasn't seen in decades?
Yes, and again, the choice doesn't look surprising in hindsight, because Jokowi now controlled parliament, controlled political parties, controlled a lot of the elite networks within the state. So it looked quite natural to some of his opponents to move the focus point of political opposition to the streets. And that's where we haven't really had a lot of political contestation since 1998 when Suharto fell. So that's the macro political context. Within that macro political context, you have a number of social developments in Indonesia, as well as global patterns as well, that supported that shift from intra-institutional competition to extra-parliamentary mobilization of popular sentiments.
Before we go to the interests and the perfect storm that seemed to develop among some of the opponents of Jokowi, how do you describe the global dimension to this? What's going on globally that is we also see expressed in Indonesia?
And globally, you see in the United States, in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, so in the UK, but also in Australia, the breaking down of taboos, the breaking down of political correctness. Those are institutionalized forms of protections for minorities that keep societies together. That means you need to have a form of togetherness in a society that deals with diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity, and so that means there is a political code, there's a political etiquette, if you will, in order to make these societies work. Now, with Trump's victory in the United States, but also Brexit and the rise of populist governments in Eastern Europe and the rise and re-rise of populist politicians in Australia, we have seen a major challenge towards these taboos, towards this, what they malign as political correctness. That means it is suddenly okay to call Mexicans rapists. It is okay to call Muslims terrorists. It is okay to call blacks, poor inhabitants of the inner cities and so on. All things that 10 years ago would have been unthinkable, or at least it would have led to widespread condemnation. In Indonesia, the same is true with the Chinese minority, which for the last 15, 16 years had been protected by these taboos. It was not allowable to attack them directly. It was not socially acceptable to use certain terms for them. It was not on, so to speak, to use certain pejorative terms for them. All of that is now on the cards again.
Right.
And this was an element that allowed these populist mobilizations in Indonesia against a Christian Chinese governor to proceed.
Right, which led to perhaps 750,000 people in the streets on the 2nd of December. So it's not just that taboos have been loosened, but there's also has been an amazing narrative built up, as you point out, and also a movement, an organization. How would you describe why that organization came together so quickly?
It came together so quickly because it involved, in what you earlier referred to as a perfect storm, it involved the coincidence of so many interests and political actors at the same time. So we have a former president who has a very strong interest in his son winning the elections against Ahok, the Christian Chinese governor of Jakarta, and that is tied to the interest of personal dynasty building from Widodo on the side, the former president of Indonesia. Then you had religious organizations, both radical and conservative, that had been marginalized by the Jokowi government and now felt that this was the perfect opportunity to get back at the president, but also get back into the political game. Then you had other groups that also felt that the potential of either an Ahok victory in Jakarta in 2017 or a Jokowi victory in the presidential race in 2019 was detrimental to their interests. And so all of these groups, with their financial power, with their power over opinion building within the Muslim community, all those groups with logistical and organizational capacities came together to work on these demonstrations. Why they worked so well? I think it was essential to convince a lot of ordinary Indonesians that participating in these elections was not equivalent to racism or being a religious figure. That was part of the narrative. The narrative that was built up was, this is not a case against the Chinese, this is not a case against non-Muslims. This is a case about law enforcement. This is a case where we're asking the state to enforce the blasphemy laws that exist, and we're asking the president to not protect somebody he's very close with, Ahok, in the name of political power games. So that was the narrative created that allowed a lot of ordinary Indonesians that feel generally skeptical towards a radical or right-wing Islamist agenda to participate. However, again, at the end of the day, a lot of these sentiments relate to the fact that many Jakartans, many Indonesians feel deeply uncomfortable with a Chinese Christian being the leader of the capital. Right? There's a lot of rhetoric built around why people participated in these demonstrations, but at the core of it is a deep sense of discomfort with the fact that a non-Muslim, and the Chinese and that, is in that position. I think it would be absolutely unthinkable that we would be in this situation if we had a Muslim governor and who had said something similar. We would not be where we are today.
And now Jokowi, as in your talk, is flailing. He doesn't know how to respond.
Yeah.
And so his supposed consolidated strength, now, where does it go?
Well, it depends on a number of factors. What we need to watch is what the impact of the demonstrations are on Jokowi's personal approval rating. The only indication that we have so far is there was a very slight decline of like 2% or so, from 69 to 67%, which would not be significant, right? If he maintains that level of popular support despite the demonstrations, or some would say even because of the demonstrations, because he has now chosen to accommodate some of the conservative interests, then he will be personally fine. He will be stable and he will remain the front runner for 2019. The question, however, is at what cost? At what cost for Indonesian democracy? It may well be that Jokowi remains the only person with a very strong chance of winning 2019, but he may preside over a democracy that is much reduced in its quality.
Yeah, well, we will see. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Thank you, Margaret.